By the middle of 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had shifted. Germany had suffered a crushing defeat at Stalingrad in February. Over 90,000 German soldiers had surrendered, and many more had been killed or wounded. The loss left the German army weakened and shaken. Their advance into the Soviet Union had stopped, and the Red Army now held the initiative. Hitler knew he needed a victory to restore German morale and to show the world that Germany could still fight. The target for the next German offensive was the Kursk salient. This bulge in the front line stretched over 150 kilometers, held by strong Soviet forces. It was a strategic point. Capturing it would allow German forces to strike deep into Soviet territory, potentially encircle Soviet armies, and reopen the possibility of moving toward key cities like Orel and Belgorod. Hitler believed a victory here could turn the tide on the Eastern Front. Planning for the operation began months in advance. German commanders, including Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Hitler's most trusted strategists, and Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, organized a massive offensive. They called the plan Operation Citadel. Von Manstein proposed a pincer movement, one group attacking from the north, the other from the south, aiming to meet near Kursk and trap the Soviet forces in between. The Germans hoped their tanks and mechanized infantry could break through the Soviet lines quickly. On the Soviet side, commanders were not idle. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Konstantin Rokossovsky oversaw a vast network of defenses. The Red Army had anticipated a German attack. They had learned from the mistakes of past battles, including Kharkov and Stalingrad. Every hill, village, and road leading into the salient was fortified. Trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles were built in layers. Mines covered the approaches, designed to stop or slow German tanks. Soviet engineers worked tirelessly, and civilian labor was used to dig defensive positions. The scale of the forces involved was enormous. On the German side, there were more than 900,000 men, including infantry, artillery, and support units. Around 2,700 tanks were ready to roll, including the new Panther and Tiger tanks, supported by over 2,000 aircraft. The Soviets had prepared an even larger force. Estimates suggest more than 1.3 million men defended the salient, supported by nearly 5,000 tanks and thousands of artillery pieces. The air forces on both sides were ready to contest the skies, knowing air support would be crucial. The Germans believed their armored divisions, known as Panzer divisions, could pierce Soviet defenses. They had some of the most advanced tanks in the world. The Tiger I was heavily armored and could destroy enemy tanks at long range. The Panther tank was fast and powerful, designed to outgun Soviet T-34s. German commanders hoped their combined arms approach, using tanks, infantry, and artillery together, would overwhelm the defenders before the Soviets could respond with their reserves. However, the Soviets had prepared extensively. Minefields ran for kilometers in depth, and anti-tank ditches blocked likely German routes. Trenches zigzagged across fields and forests. Soviet artillery positions were hidden to hit attacking tanks from multiple angles. Soldiers were trained to fight in these fortified positions, and local knowledge of the terrain gave the defenders an advantage. Reserves were stationed just behind the front lines, ready to launch counterattacks at the first sign of a breakthrough. Intelligence played a key role. Both sides gathered information about the enemy. German reconnaissance units surveyed the Soviet positions, hoping to find weak spots. At the same time, Soviet spies and scouts monitored German movements. The Soviets knew roughly when the Germans would attack. Stalin's leadership demanded that no forward positions be abandoned, and that every inch of ground be held. The Soviets were determined to absorb the German offensive and then strike back with their reserves. Weather and terrain added to the complexity. The summer of 1943 was hot and dry. Dust from roads could reveal troop movements. Fields of wheat and rye stretched across the landscape, providing both cover and obstacles. Rivers, streams, and small forests could slow mechanized units. Commanders on both sides had to account for the difficulties of moving thousands of men, tanks, and guns through this terrain. The stakes were enormous. Hitler saw Operation Citadel as a chance to regain control of the Eastern Front. He believed a decisive victory could force the Soviets onto the defensive, possibly even collapse their morale and open the way to Moscow. For the Soviets, holding Kursk was vital. Losing the salient could allow Germany to threaten central Russia and potentially change the course of the war. Both sides knew that failure or success here would affect not just the soldiers on the battlefield, but the fate of nations. By July 5, 1943, everything was in place. German soldiers stood in their positions, engines idling, waiting for the signal to advance. Soviet troops crouched in trenches, eyes fixed on the horizon, ready for the storm to come. Field commanders made their last calculations. Maps were studied, orders given, radios checked. Dust and heat rose into the air. Silence hung over the battlefield, broken only by distant artillery and the hum of engines. Every detail mattered. Every mine, every trench, every tank would play a role in what was about to become the largest tank battle in history. The world was watching, though it did not yet know how brutal and decisive this engagement would become. Soldiers on both sides understood that this day could define their lives and the outcome of the war itself. July 5, 1943. Kursk, the largest armored clash in history, was about to begin. After months of careful planning, the Germans were ready to launch Operation Citadel. Hitler demanded a decisive strike. He wanted to crush the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient and restore the prestige of the German army after the defeat at Stalingrad. The plan relied on speed and surprise. 2 German pincers would advance from the north and south, aiming to meet near Kursk and encircle the Red Army. The northern attack was led by Field Marshal Walter Model. He commanded the 9th Army and several panzer divisions, including the 9th and 18th. Their goal was to push south through heavily defended Soviet positions and link up with the southern forces. The southern attack, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, included the 4th Panzer Army and the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. They were to strike north from Belgorod, cutting the salient in two. German intelligence suggested the Soviets had concentrated many troops, but commanders believed their tanks and artillery could break the lines before the Red Army's reserves could intervene. The Germans had new weapons to test in battle. The Panther tanks, equipped with powerful 75mm guns, could destroy Soviet tanks at long range. The Tiger I, heavily armored, could withstand most Soviet fire. Aircraft such as the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers would support ground troops, targeting trenches and artillery positions. The Soviets, however, were not passive. Stalin, along with Generals Zhukov and Rokossovsky, had prepared one of the most fortified defensive systems of the war. Minefields stretched in multiple layers. Anti-tank ditches cut across likely German paths. Trenches and bunkers were reinforced with concrete, and soldiers were trained to hold their ground under the heaviest assault. Camouflaged artillery positions were hidden in forests and villages, ready to strike any attacking force. Soviet reserves, including tank armies and fresh infantry, were positioned to counterattack as soon as German units advanced. Reconnaissance was critical for both sides. German scouts moved ahead of the main force, mapping Soviet defenses and searching for gaps. However, Soviet deception operations were effective. Fake positions, dummy tanks, and false supply lines misled the German planners. By the time the Germans launched their attack, the Soviets had already anticipated where the main strikes might occur and prepared their defenses accordingly. Logistics was another major challenge. The German forces needed constant fuel, ammunition, and food for hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of tanks. Supply lines stretched across difficult terrain, vulnerable to attack from Soviet partisans or airstrikes. Each division had to move carefully, keeping enough distance to avoid congestion on narrow roads, but close enough to support the advancing units. The coordination of infantry, tanks, and artillery required precise timing. Any delay could allow Soviet reserves to strike exposed units. Weather also played a role in planning. July in Kursk was hot and dry. Dust from moving vehicles could reveal positions and alert defenders. Rain, though not forecast, could turn roads to mud, slowing tank movements. Commanders had to consider every factor, from visibility to river crossings, in their strategy. The German attack plan was clear: push fast, break through Soviet defenses, and link the northern and southern pincers to trap enemy forces. But the Soviets were equally determined to resist. Their goal was to absorb the German attack, hold the salient, and then counterattack with their reserves to destroy the German forces in a single, decisive engagement. Every hill and village was prepared to slow the enemy. Every artillery battery positioned to strike with maximum effect. The scale of the forces involved was immense. On the southern front, the Germans had nearly 500,000 men, with over 1,200 tanks and 1,500 aircraft. In the north, around 400,000 troops awaited, with more than 1,500 tanks. The Soviets concentrated over 1.3 million men along the salient, with nearly 5,000 tanks and thousands of artillery pieces. Both sides understood that the coming battle would be one of the largest and most destructive in history. The human element was critical. German soldiers were experienced but aware of the risks. Many had fought at Stalingrad or in earlier campaigns on the Eastern Front. They knew that failure could mean death or capture. Soviet troops, often younger and less experienced, were equally determined. They had seen villages destroyed and comrades killed in previous battles. Morale, training, and leadership would all influence the outcome. As July 5th approached, the final preparations were made. German units moved into position under the cover of night. Engineers cleared roads, supply trains moved forward, and command posts were established. Radios were tested, orders confirmed, and reconnaissance reports reviewed. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers checked mines, reinforced trenches, and prepared for the first German assault. Every second counted. The battlefield was ready. The Germans hoped their armored and mechanized units could break the Soviet lines and achieve a rapid victory. The Soviets were prepared to absorb the attack and strike back with fresh forces. Both sides understood the stakes. Kursk was more than a battle. It was a test of strategy, technology, leadership, and human endurance. On the morning of July 5th, the first German units were poised to advance. The air was thick with dust and tension. Artillery guns stood silent, ready to roar. Tanks waited behind concealed positions. Soldiers gripped their weapons and scanned the horizon. The battle for Kursk, the largest tank engagement in history, was about to unfold. The human cost at Kursk would have been immense, even if the Germans had succeeded. Soldiers on both sides faced relentless danger. The German infantry advanced through open fields under constant threat of mines, artillery, and Soviet counterattacks. Tanks rolled forward, vulnerable to anti-tank guns hidden in trenches or behind hills. Many soldiers carried little more than a rifle, a helmet, and the knowledge that death could come at any moment. On the Soviet side, civilians were caught in the middle. Villages along the salient were evacuated when possible, but many remained, living in fear of artillery bombardments and tank fire. Women and children hid in basements, listening to the thunder of explosions and the screams of soldiers. Hospitals struggled to care for the wounded. Medical supplies were limited, and evacuation routes were often cut off. Casualties would have been measured in tens of thousands on the first day alone. Soldiers endured extreme fatigue. Days of waiting in trenches, nights spent in foxholes, and the constant roar of engines and artillery took a mental toll. Some panicked at sudden attacks. Others froze under the weight of responsibility. Leadership on both sides worked tirelessly to maintain order, issue orders, and keep soldiers focused. Yet, in the chaos of battle, training and courage were often the only things keeping men alive. The psychological strain was intense. Survivors of previous battles, like Stalingrad, carried the memories of defeat. Fear, anxiety, and exhaustion became constant companions. Despite this, many soldiers continued to fight with determination. Human endurance would be tested to its limits in a battle that promised destruction on a scale never seen before. Tactical decisions were critical in determining the outcome. German commanders relied on speed and coordination. Panzer divisions were meant to punch through weak points in the Soviet lines. Infantry would follow, securing territory and neutralizing resistance. Artillery would fire in concentrated bursts to destroy bunkers and trenches. Reconnaissance units scouted ahead, reporting Soviet positions. Soviet commanders, however, had studied German tactics. They layered their defenses to slow the advance. Mines were placed in zigzag patterns, forcing tanks into predictable routes. Trenches were dug to channel infantry into kill zones. Anti-tank ditches and hidden artillery ensured that every advance would cost the attacker heavily. Soviet reserves waited to exploit any German overextension, ready to launch counterattacks at the right moment. Coordination was a constant challenge. German units needed precise timing to ensure tanks and infantry moved together. A delay in one sector could expose flanks to Soviet fire. Communication lines were often disrupted by artillery or sabotage, forcing commanders to make rapid decisions with incomplete information. Every choice had consequences. Advance too fast, and units risked being cut off. Move too slowly, and the enemy could reinforce positions. Decisions were made under pressure. Field commanders like von Manstein and Model needed to balance risk and speed. They had to predict Soviet responses, adapt to terrain, and account for mechanical failures. On the Soviet side, Rokossovsky and Zhukov had to allocate reserves carefully, deciding where to strike first and when to hold positions. Tactical thinking, more than brute force, would define success or failure. Technology played a decisive role at Kursk. German tanks, such as the Tiger I and Panther, were among the most advanced in the world. The Tiger could destroy Soviet tanks at long range, and its armor was almost impervious to standard Soviet guns. The Panther combined firepower, speed, and armor, designed specifically to counter the Soviet T-34. German artillery and aircraft provided additional strength. Nebelwerfers and heavy field guns could bombard Soviet positions before an assault. Dive bombers like the Ju-87 Stuka targeted fortifications, troop concentrations, and supply lines. Coordination between ground and air forces was intended to create breakthroughs that would allow German units to exploit weaknesses in Soviet defenses. The Soviets, however, were not without powerful tools. The T-34 tank, though older, was fast, well-armored, and easy to produce in large numbers. Soviet artillery was dispersed and camouflaged, making it difficult to target. Anti-tank weapons, such as the 45mm and 76mm guns, were positioned in prepared firing zones. Mines, barbed wire, and bunkers created layered defenses that challenged German armor. Aircraft engagement was another crucial factor. The Luftwaffe sought to gain air superiority, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns contested every advance. Reconnaissance planes exposed movements, and night raids disrupted supply lines. Technology alone could not win the battle. It had to be combined with tactics, coordination, and human skill. The interplay of technology, strategy, and human endurance defined the battlefield. Every tank, artillery shell, and aircraft sortie could tip the balance. Kursk was not just a battle of men. It was a contest of machines, firepower, and innovation. Success depended on using all available tools efficiently while anticipating the enemy's next move. Leadership at Kursk would have been decisive. German commanders like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and Field Marshal Walter Model carried the weight of Hitler's expectations. Von Manstein, known for his bold strategies, aimed to execute a fast, precise pincer attack from the south. Model, experienced in defensive and counteroffensive operations, prepared the northern forces for a strong push into Soviet lines. Every decision, from where to concentrate tanks, how to deploy infantry, and when to call in artillery support, was critical. Hitler himself was heavily involved. His obsession with a decisive victory influenced operational planning. He insisted on personally approving the timing of the offensive and the allocation of elite units. However, Hitler's interference sometimes delayed or complicated decisions. German field commanders had to balance obedience with practical battlefield judgment. Choosing when to advance and when to hold back could mean the difference between a breakthrough and disaster. On the Soviet side, leadership was equally significant. Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Konstantin Rokossovsky coordinated vast numbers of troops and defensive systems. Zhukov emphasized depth in defense, ensuring multiple layers of resistance. Rokossovsky focused on positioning reserves to respond rapidly to breakthroughs. Both had experience from earlier battles and understood German tactics. Their decisions, where to place artillery, when to commit tanks, and how to protect supply lines, shaped the battlefield even before the first shot was fired. Leadership extended beyond commanders. Company and platoon leaders were responsible for directing small units under extreme pressure. They maintained order, executed orders, and adapted to changing conditions. Soldiers relied on these leaders to make critical calls during moments of chaos. At Kursk, effective leadership could preserve lives, exploit weaknesses, and turn a tense engagement into operational success. From the Soviet perspective, the German offensive was a dire threat. They understood the capabilities of German armor and the skill of their commanders. Intelligence reports indicated that elite Panzer divisions would spearhead attacks, supported by artillery and air power. The Soviets prepared for this by reinforcing key sectors and deploying anti-tank units at critical points. The Soviet soldiers themselves were aware of the danger. Trenches and bunkers were crowded with men ready to repel attacks. Mines covered the approaches, and anti-tank ditches blocked the most likely paths of German armor. Soldiers were trained to exploit every opportunity, hitting tanks from concealed positions, coordinating artillery strikes, and resisting enemy infantry advances. Morale was maintained through strict discipline and the promise of reinforcements. Soviet leadership also planned counterattacks. While German forces were expected to strike first, reserves were held in readiness to hit exposed flanks or recapture lost positions. Soviet commanders calculated where and when to commit tank armies, aiming to encircle or destroy German spearheads. Even under extreme pressure, they maintained flexibility, understanding that the outcome depended on both preparation and real-time decision-making. The Red Army's perspective emphasized endurance. Every day, soldiers and officers knew that they faced not just superior weapons in some cases, but also the tactical genius of German commanders. Success required cohesion, discipline, and careful use of resources. Every defensive measure, from mines to hidden artillery, was designed to slow and bleed the attacker, buying time for reserves to act. If Operation Citadel had succeeded, the consequences for the Eastern Front and the wider war would have been profound. A German breakthrough at Kursk could have allowed the Wehrmacht to encircle Soviet forces in the salient, inflicting heavy casualties and destroying key units. The capture of Kursk and surrounding cities like Orel and Belgorod would have opened a path into central Russia, threatening Soviet supply lines and communication networks. Strategically, success could have bolstered German morale after Stalingrad. It might have delayed Soviet offensives, forced Stalin to divert forces from other fronts, and potentially prolonged the war in the East. Hitler could have claimed a major victory, reinforcing his influence over military strategy and boosting confidence in the German army. However, even a German victory would not have guaranteed ultimate success. The Soviets had immense reserves, industrial capacity, and manpower. While a breakthrough at Kursk would have been devastating, Soviet forces could regroup further east. Winter, long supply lines, and overstretched German units would remain critical challenges. The battle would have shifted momentum, but not necessarily ended Soviet resistance. The strategic consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Allied planners in the West would have watched closely, adjusting their strategies in France, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. A German victory at Kursk could have forced changes in the timing of operations like D-Day or increased pressure on supply lines to the Soviet Union. Politically, it would have strengthened Germany's position in occupied Europe, potentially affecting civilian morale and collaboration in occupied territories. At the same time, a German victory would have come at a heavy human cost. Tens of thousands of soldiers killed or wounded on both sides, villages destroyed, and civilian suffering would have accompanied the strategic gain. The balance between tactical success and human cost would remain stark, a reminder that even victories in war carry enormous consequences. Kursk, from the perspective of both leaders and soldiers, technology and strategy, represented a turning point. It was a test not only of military skill but also of endurance, foresight, and decision-making under pressure. Every choice, every movement, and every engagement had the potential to ripple far beyond the battlefield. July 5, 1943, dawned over the Kursk salient. The sun rose over fields scarred by trenches and minefields. German troops were in position. Tanks rumbled quietly along concealed routes. Infantry crouched in foxholes. Artillery units awaited orders. The tension was palpable. Every commander, soldier, and machine was ready for the signal to advance. At precisely 3:30 a.m., the first German artillery barges struck Soviet positions. Thousands of shells screamed across the horizon, targeting trenches, bunkers, and defensive strongpoints. The northern attack, led by Field Marshal Walter Model's Ninth Army, focused on breaking through Soviet lines near Orel. The southern attack, under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's 4th Panzer Army, pushed north from Belgorod, aiming to meet the northern forces near Kursk. German panzer divisions moved in waves. Tiger I tanks led the assault, their heavy armor resistant to Soviet fire. Panthers followed, using their long-range guns to destroy T-34s and anti-tank positions. Infantry units advanced behind, clearing obstacles and securing captured ground. Artillery fired in coordinated barrages, suppressing enemy positions before German troops entered. In the south, the SS Panzer Corps spearheaded the attack. The 1st and 2nd SS Panzer divisions advanced through heavily mined fields. Engineers followed, clearing paths and detonating mines. Soviet soldiers fought fiercely. Anti-tank guns and hidden artillery fired relentlessly. Mines destroyed some tanks instantly. Trenches and bunkers provided cover, forcing German infantry into deadly close-quarters combat. Casualties mounted quickly. Meanwhile, in the north, Model's forces encountered deep Soviet defenses. Layers of minefields and anti-tank ditches slowed the advance. Soviet artillery targeted German tanks as they crossed open fields. Infantry units moved cautiously, coordinating with tanks to avoid ambushes. Despite careful planning, losses were high. German commanders adjusted their strategy, shifting units to exploit weaker sectors. Air support was critical. The Luftwaffe sent hundreds of aircraft to bomb Soviet positions and support the advancing tanks. Stuka dive bombers targeted bunkers and artillery emplacements. Fighters engaged Soviet aircraft in the skies, seeking to maintain air superiority. Soviet anti-aircraft guns and fighters resisted fiercely. Every sortie carried risk, and many aircraft were lost to enemy fire. Communication was a constant challenge. Radios crackled with updates, but artillery, smoke, and terrain disrupted signals. Commanders made rapid decisions with incomplete information. A delay in one sector could leave tanks exposed. German forces coordinated carefully, but the Soviets anticipated some movements, responding quickly with counterfire and small unit attacks. Despite heavy resistance, German units achieved localized breakthroughs. In the south, elements of the 4th Panzer Army penetrated the first lines of Soviet defenses. Soviet defenders were forced to fall back, regroup, and activate reserves. Engineers cleared paths through minefields, allowing more tanks and infantry to advance. These early gains were significant, but they came at a high cost. The human toll was immediate and stark. Soldiers on both sides were wounded or killed within minutes. Explosions ripped through trenches. Tanks caught fire from mines or artillery shells. Infantry fought in close quarters, using rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers to survive. Medics worked frantically, but evacuation routes were often blocked. Fear, exhaustion, and adrenaline defined every moment. By midday, the Germans had made measurable progress. Panzer spearheads had created narrow corridors through the Soviet defenses. But the Red Army's depth of preparation slowed the advance. Reserves were committed to plug gaps, counterattack exposed flanks, and reinforce key positions. Every gain required intense effort and cost lives. The terrain shaped the battle. Open fields favored German tanks, but forests, rivers, and villages provided cover for Soviet defenders. Engineers worked to build bridges and clear paths, while infantry navigated obstacles under fire. The combination of natural and man-made defenses made progress slow and dangerous. As the day ended, the battlefield was a scene of destruction. Craters, destroyed tanks, burned out vehicles, and scattered equipment littered the ground. Soldiers were exhausted, yet command units continued issuing orders. Every decision, from advancing a platoon to committing reserves, influenced the unfolding battle. The Germans had achieved initial successes, but the fight was far from over. The Soviets were ready to respond, and the outcome remained uncertain. The first day of Operation Citadel demonstrated the intensity, scale, and stakes of the engagement. German units had penetrated Soviet defenses in some areas, showing the potential for success. Yet resistance was strong, casualties were high, and coordination challenges remained. The Battle of Kursk was now fully underway, a struggle that would test commanders, soldiers, and machines like never before. By July 6, 1943, German forces had pushed deeper into the Kursk salient. In the south, the SS Panzer Corps continued its advance, targeting key Soviet positions around Belgorod. Engineers cleared additional minefields, allowing Panther and Tiger tanks to spearhead the assault. Infantry units followed closely, securing villages and suppressing remaining resistance. Artillery barges softened Soviet positions before each advance, while Luftwaffe aircraft patrolled the skies to protect ground units and strike enemy fortifications. The Northern Offensive Undermodel made steady progress as well. Despite thick layers of Soviet defenses, German forces identified weak points in the lines. Tactical shifts allowed panzer divisions to exploit these gaps, creating small breakthroughs. Artillery units moved forward to support the advancing tanks, while infantry cleared trenches and bunkers. Soviet soldiers fought tenaciously, but the German coordination of armor, artillery, and infantry made the northern push increasingly dangerous for defenders. As German units approached the outskirts of Kursk, resistance intensified. Soviet commanders committed additional reserves, including tank armies and fresh infantry divisions. Counterattacks aimed to isolate German spearheads, destroy exposed tanks, and prevent the pincers from joining. Explosions rocked the battlefield as artillery, mines, and anti-tank fire tore through German formations. Each advance came at tremendous human cost. In some sectors, German tanks broke through initial Soviet defenses, creating narrow corridors toward the city. The prospect of capturing Kursk became real. Panzer commanders pressed forward, balancing speed with caution to avoid ambushes. Infantry units cleared obstacles, secured roads, and prepared for urban combat. Artillery targeted remaining strongpoints to allow armored units to advance. German officers coordinated movements under constant pressure, knowing that timing and precision were critical. The Luftwaffe intensified operations, bombing Soviet supply lines and fortifications around Kursk. Fighters clashed with Soviet aircraft, seeking air superiority to protect ground troops. Each sortie carried risk, as Soviet anti-aircraft fire was concentrated and effective. Tanks and artillery on the ground relied on these air attacks to suppress enemy positions. Coordination between air and ground forces was essential for maintaining the momentum of the offensive. Despite gains, the Soviet defensive depth remained formidable. Secondary lines of trenches, anti-tank ditches, and fortified positions slowed German progress. Counterattacks from reserves forced panzer units to halt, regroup, and fight in multiple directions simultaneously. The battle became a struggle of attrition, with every square kilometer costing lives and equipment. By July 7th, German forces had reached the edge of Kursk in the south. Small units entered the outskirts, encountering barricades, mined streets, and pockets of Soviet resistance. Urban combat added a new layer of danger. Infantry and engineers had to clear buildings while tanks provided fire support. Soviet defenders used every available advantage, from fortified buildings to hidden anti-tank guns. The pace of the advance slowed, and casualties mounted. Operationally, the breakthrough at Kursk would have shifted momentum on the Eastern Front. German units capturing the salient could threaten Soviet supply lines, disrupt communications, and force the Red Army to commit more reserves. Hitler could have claimed a major victory, boosting German morale and reinforcing his authority over military planning. The German High Command would have reassessed strategic options, potentially planning further advances toward Orel and Belgorod. Yet, even with a partial capture of Kursk, challenges remained. Supply lines were stretched thin. German units faced fatigue, mechanical failures, and constant Soviet counterattacks. Urban combat and fortified positions slowed progress and increased casualties. The Red Army's reserves, industrial capacity, and ability to regroup remained formidable obstacles. A victory at Kursk would have been significant, but it would not have ended Soviet resistance. By the end of the first week of the battle, the scale of destruction was immense. Burned-out tanks, craters, destroyed vehicles, and shattered infrastructure marked every advance. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted, wounded, or killed. Commanders continued issuing orders under extreme pressure, coordinating attacks, reinforcements, and logistics. Every movement had to be calculated precisely to maintain momentum and minimize losses. The potential capture of Kursk demonstrated the limits of even a powerful German offensive. Success required more than technology and numbers. It demanded precise timing, leadership, and coordination under fire. The Red Army's resilience meant that even a tactical victory could quickly transform into a prolonged struggle. For both sides, the battle would test endurance, strategy, and the human spirit in ways never seen before. By July 10th, the German advance had created hope for a decisive breakthrough, yet the battle remained uncertain. The pincers were close, but not fully joined. Soviet reserves were poised to strike exposed flanks. The outcome of the battle, even in a scenario where the Germans achieved initial success, was far from guaranteed. Kursk had become a crucible of men, machines, and strategy, a defining moment on the Eastern Front that would shape the war's course, regardless of immediate tactical gains. The battlefield at Kursk after the initial German success was a scene of devastation. Craters, burned-out tanks, destroyed vehicles, and shattered buildings littered the landscape. Villages were reduced to rubble, and fields that had once grown wheat and rye were torn apart by artillery and tank tracks. Roads were blocked with wreckage, making movement for both sides difficult. The human cost was immense and immediate. German casualties were high. Thousands of infantrymen were killed or wounded in the first days of the offensive. Tanks were destroyed by mines, artillery, or close-range attacks. Engineers clearing minefields faced constant danger, with many losing their lives while creating safe paths for advancing forces. Medical units struggled to treat the wounded, often under fire, with limited supplies. Fatigue and stress added to the toll. Soviet losses were even greater. Defending in depth had slowed the German advance, but it came at a high cost. Soldiers in trenches and bunkers faced relentless bombardment. Tank crews confronted superior German armor in deadly engagements. Civilians who remained in villages were caught in the crossfire or buried under collapsing buildings. Hospitals overflowed with casualties, and evacuation routes were often destroyed by ongoing fighting. The psychological impact on soldiers was profound. Fear, exhaustion, and constant danger weighed heavily. German troops, despite initial successes, faced the anxiety of being cut off by Soviet counterattacks or trapped in mined fields. Soldiers who survived early assaults were physically and mentally drained. On the Soviet side, the relentless advance of German armor tested morale, even among those well prepared for defense. Many soldiers witnessed the death of comrades within minutes, while others had to continue fighting despite injuries. Commanders on both sides faced immense pressure. German leaders like von Manstein and Model had to coordinate attacks across a fragmented battlefield, ensuring that breakthroughs were exploited before Soviet reserves could respond. Every decision was critical. Soviet commanders, including Zhukov and Rokossovsky, worked tirelessly to commit reserves, plug gaps, and maintain order under fire. The scale of coordination required was immense, with radios, couriers, and signals all essential for communication. The terrain bore the scars of the battle. Forests were stripped bare, rivers clogged with wreckage, and fields cratered by artillery. Mines remained hidden, creating danger long after the initial attacks. Villages destroyed by artillery became obstacles for movement, while bridges and roads were damaged, slowing supply lines. The physical destruction made continued operations difficult for both attackers and defenders. The human stories reflected the enormity of the battle. Infantrymen advanced through smoke and fire, carrying wounded comrades, clearing obstacles, and engaging in close combat. Tank crews navigated minefields and anti-tank fire, often losing comrades within moments. Medics moved between positions, attempting to save lives while under bombardment. Civilians who had survived evacuation returned to find homes destroyed and families lost. By the end of the first week of fighting, casualties on both sides had reached tens of thousands. German estimates suggested that several thousand soldiers were killed or wounded in the initial breakthroughs. Soviet losses were even higher due to concentrated defensive positions and repeated attacks. The physical destruction and human suffering highlighted the brutal reality of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. Psychological consequences extended beyond immediate fear and exhaustion. Soldiers carried trauma that would last for years, shaped by the intensity and scale of combat. Commanders faced the weight of responsibility for the lives lost under their orders. Civilians confronted the sudden collapse of infrastructure, loss of homes, and the constant threat of violence. The battlefield at Kursk became a symbol of the immense human cost of war. Despite German advances, the Soviets remained resilient. Reserves were positioned to counterattack, and fortified lines beyond the initial front continued to resist. The battle demonstrated that even with superior technology and initial tactical success, the human and logistical costs of offensive operations were enormous. Every advance required careful coordination, immense effort, and acceptance of inevitable casualties. The first stage of Kursk's aftermath revealed a dual reality. A German breakthrough was possible, and yet the cost in lives, morale, and destruction was staggering. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike faced a landscape transformed by fire, steel, and human endurance. The intensity of the battle, even in a scenario where Germany succeeded, foreshadowed the challenges that would follow in the weeks and months ahead. The initial German success at Kursk would have shifted the strategic balance on the Eastern Front, at least temporarily. With the southern and northern pincers advancing, the capture of Kursk and nearby cities like Orel and Belgorod could have disrupted Soviet supply lines and communications. German forces could have threatened critical rail networks, making it difficult for the Red Army to move reserves quickly to the front. Hitler would likely have celebrated the breakthrough. A partial victory at Kursk would have bolstered morale in the Wehrmacht and provided propaganda to restore confidence after the defeat at Stalingrad. German field commanders, such as von Manstein and Model, would have been credited for operational skill. However, the leadership faced enormous challenges. Maintaining momentum required constant coordination, secure supply lines, and rapid exploitation of narrow corridors created by initial breakthroughs. Any hesitation could allow the Soviets to regroup and counterattack. Soviet leadership reacted swiftly. Even if the Germans had captured key positions, Stalin, Zhukov, and Rokossovsky had planned for a deep defense in depth. Soviet reserves could be moved from other sectors to slow or halt further German advances. Artillery, tank armies, and infantry units were repositioned to block the German thrusts, creating new defensive lines. Reports indicate that Soviet commanders were already anticipating this scenario, having prepared alternate strategies to prevent total encirclement. Strategic shifts would have had long-term implications. A successful German offensive could have delayed future Soviet operations, giving the Wehrmacht temporary control of the initiative. The Eastern Front might have seen months of continued German advances, potentially forcing the Allies to reconsider plans for operations in Western Europe, including the timing of large-scale landings. The psychological effect on both German and Soviet forces would have been significant. German soldiers would have gained confidence, while Soviet troops would have faced a renewed sense of urgency to hold the line. Official reports from German units after the hypothetical breakthrough would have detailed the scale of destruction, losses, and gains. Infantry reports, tank logs, and Luftwaffe sorties would have recorded the thousands of casualties, destroyed enemy equipment, and occupied territory. Commanders would have highlighted the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, while also noting the logistical difficulties in sustaining the offensive. Historical analysis suggests that even with a partial success, the Germans would have faced critical supply issues and high attrition rates. Soviet reports would have reflected both the resilience of the Red Army and the cost of the German offensive. Officers documented the destruction of villages, the use of reserves, and the heroic efforts of soldiers in delaying and counterattacking the Wehrmacht. Casualty reports indicated the high human cost, emphasizing the sacrifices required to absorb and resist the German advance. These reports would later provide historians with detailed insight into the scale and intensity of the battle. Historical assessments suggest that a German victory at Kursk would have been significant but not decisive. While the capture of the salient could have forced the Soviets onto the defensive temporarily, the Red Army's industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and strategic depth remained intact. Over time, the Soviets could regroup, counterattack, and reclaim lost ground. Historians such as David Glantz and Antony Beevor note that Kursk represented a turning point not only for its physical scale, but also for demonstrating the limits of German offensive capability against a prepared, resilient opponent. Verified quotes from commanders and analysts underline the stakes. Von Manstein later reflected on the difficulty of attacking heavily fortified positions, emphasizing the challenge of balancing speed, coordination, and human cost. Zhukov described the importance of depth in defense, noting that the preparation of successive lines allowed the Red Army to absorb even the most concentrated attacks. These reflections provide insight into the careful planning, foresight, and human endurance that defined the battle. The strategic consequences extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Even if the Germans had temporarily seized Kursk, the long-term effect on the war would have been limited by logistical constraints, the resilience of Soviet forces, and the broader context of World War II. The battle demonstrated that operational success required not only tactical skill and advanced technology, but also the capacity to sustain forces under extreme conditions. The aftermath also highlighted the human and material cost of armored warfare. Thousands of soldiers were killed or wounded, villages destroyed, and entire landscapes transformed by fire and steel. Supplies were depleted rapidly, infrastructure damaged, and morale tested on both sides. Even in a scenario of success, the consequences were immediate and severe, reflecting the brutal reality of total war. By mid-July, the battlefield remained a scene of destruction and exhaustion. German units held captured ground, but forward momentum slowed due to supply difficulties, mechanical breakdowns, and Soviet countermeasures. Soviet commanders reorganized forces and prepared for counteroffensives, showing the resilience and adaptability of the Red Army. The battle illustrated the limits of even the most well-planned offensive in the face of determined, prepared defenders. The aftermath of Kursk, even in a scenario of German success, underlined several truths. Leadership decisions shaped the battle's progress. Technological and tactical advantages could create temporary breakthroughs, and human cost remained staggering. Strategic shifts were possible, but they were neither simple nor absolute. The battle would continue to influence decisions, morale, and operations on the Eastern Front for months to come, shaping the broader course of World War II. Operation Citadel, at Kursk, stands as one of the largest and most intense battles of World War II. Even in a scenario where the Germans had succeeded, the human cost would have been staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides would have died or been wounded. Villages and farmland would have been destroyed, and survivors, both soldiers and civilians, would have faced exhaustion, fear, and trauma. The battle demonstrates the limits of military technology and strategy when faced with well-prepared defenses and human resilience. German tanks, artillery, and aircraft could achieve breakthroughs, but every gain required immense effort, coordination, and sacrifice. Soviet planning, depth of defense, and the use of reserves showed that determination and preparation could slow, contain, or even reverse the most powerful attacks. Leadership on both sides shaped the outcome. Commanders like von Manstein and Model made critical decisions under pressure, balancing risk and opportunity. Soviet leaders, including Zhukov and Rokossovsky, anticipated moves, positioned reserves, and absorbed the assault with skill. Their choices proved that foresight, flexibility, and understanding of terrain and human limits are as important as numbers or weapons. Kursk also illustrates the wider consequences of war. Even a tactical victory would not have guaranteed strategic success. Supply lines, fatigue, and the enemy's capacity to regroup remain decisive. Battles are never isolated. They are part of a larger system where human endurance, planning, and adaptability matter as much as firepower. Finally, Kursk reminds us of the human dimension of history. Beyond tanks, artillery, and strategies, the battle was fought by men facing unimaginable pressure. The bravery, fear, and determination of those soldiers shaped the course of events. Every advance, retreat, and counterattack carried lives and futures on its shoulders. In imagining a scenario where Operation Citadel succeeded, we see both the potential and the limits of military power. History, even in hypothetical outcomes, speaks through the endurance, sacrifice, and resilience of those who lived it. Kursk, in reality or in possibility, remains a testament to the scale of human courage and the cost of war. History is full of what-ifs. Imagine how different the world might have been if Operation Citadel had succeeded. If this exploration of Kursk and the Eastern Front fascinated you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more cinematic World War II documentaries. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment in history would you want to see explored next? Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the battles, leaders, and turning points that shaped our world. Every like, comment, and share helps us bring history to life, one story at a time.